The radio crackles at 3:47 a.m. Ranger Station 19, North Cascades National Park. The voice on the other end is barely a whisper, and it's shaking. There's something outside the cabin. It's not a bear. It's not... The transmission cuts. Static. Then a sound that veteran ranger Michael Thornton would later describe in his incident report as vocalizations inconsistent with any known wildlife in the region. 3 minutes of recording captured something that moved on 2 legs through 18 inches of fresh snow. Something that examined the cabin door with what sounded like deliberate, methodical testing. Something that left behind prints measuring 17 inches long, sunk 4 inches deep into frozen ground. When the backup team arrived at dawn, they found the ranger's vehicle with claw marks gouged into the metal roof. Deep gouges, made by something with enough strength to bend steel. The ranger himself was found 2 miles away, hypothermic, repeating the same phrase over and over. It looked at me. It knew. The official report listed the incident as a bear encounter. The ranger was reassigned to a desk job 3 weeks later. The recording was classified under Park Service internal protocols and hasn't been heard publicly in 37 years. Until now. For decades, we've been told that Bigfoot is folklore, a cultural myth, the product of misidentification, hoaxes, and overactive imaginations. Every blurry photograph dismissed, every footprint cast explained away, every witness account quietly filed under inconclusive. But what if the reason we keep getting the same answer is because we're not asking the right people? Park rangers, forest service workers, search and rescue teams, the men and women who spend their entire careers in the deepest wilderness areas, far from trails and tourists, in regions most Americans will never see. These aren't amateur cryptid hunters with night vision cameras. These are trained professionals with decades of experience. People who can identify animal tracks in the dark, who know the difference between elk bugling and everything else that makes noise in the forest. And a significant number of them, more than would ever say so publicly, have seen something that doesn't fit any wildlife manual ever written. In restricted wilderness zones, in areas marked no public access on maps, in regions where even experienced hikers are turned away without explanation, there are protocols, unofficial ones, procedures that don't appear in any handbook, but get passed down from senior rangers to new recruits like uncomfortable secrets. Don't camp alone in certain valleys. Don't investigate unusual vocalizations after dark. If you find prints that don't match known wildlife, photograph them, file a report, and leave the area immediately. And most importantly, if you encounter something that walks upright and isn't human, do not engage. Do not follow. Do not report it through official channels, because the moment you do, your career changes. You become a liability, a problem to be managed. We've interviewed 43 former Park Service employees under conditions of anonymity. Their stories don't match the folklore. They don't match the TV shows or the documentaries or the tabloid headlines. They match each other across different states, different decades, different wilderness areas that have no connection except one. They're all places the public isn't allowed to go. And what emerges from those testimonies is a truth far more disturbing than the legend. Because if Bigfoot is real, if it exists in the last truly wild places in North America, then someone has known about it for a very long time. And they've been making sure we don't. The indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest have known about Sasquatch for thousands of years, but their knowledge isn't the caricature you see in popular culture. The gentle forest giant, the mystical ape man. In Salish tradition, Sasquatch is a border guardian, a being that exists between the human world and the deep wilderness. Something that enforces boundaries we're not meant to cross. The Lummi Nation has oral histories describing encounters with the tall ones who would appear at the edge of settlements, watching, not threatening unless provoked, but making their presence known, a reminder that some places belong to them, not us. The Yakama people tell stories of entire hunting parties abandoning camps after finding evidence of Sasquatch nearby, not out of fear of violence, but out of respect for territory markers that were unmistakable. Twisted trees, structures made from massive logs arranged in patterns that served no purpose except to say, "This is ours." These weren't campfire tales meant to scare children. They were practical knowledge, survival information, the same way you'd teach someone which plants are poisonous or which areas flood in spring. Elders would pass down information about Sasquatch behavior, where they're likely to be encountered, what time of year they're most active, what signs indicate you're in their territory, and most crucially, what to do if you encounter one. Show no aggression, don't run, back away slowly, and leave the area. The indigenous understanding of Sasquatch isn't about proof or evidence. It's about coexistence with something that was here long before us and will be here long after. Something that has learned, over millennia, how to avoid us when it chooses to, and how to make itself known when it needs to. When European settlers arrived in the Pacific Northwest in the 19th century, they dismissed these stories as primitive superstition, and then they started encountering the same thing. The first documented account in English appears in 1840, written by Elkanah Walker, a missionary working with the Spokane tribe. He writes about stories the indigenous people told him of a race of giants which inhabit a certain mountain, always completely covered with snow. They hunt and do all their work at night. They are men stealers. They come to the camps and steal people. Walker's tone is skeptical but curious. He notes that multiple tribes, with no apparent contact with each other, tell remarkably similar stories. By the 1850s, as logging operations pushed deeper into old-growth forests, loggers began reporting encounters. Most were dismissed or attributed to bears standing upright, but some reports stood out. In 1855, a logging crew near Mount St. Helens refused to return to a particular valley after what they described as an enormous wild man threw rocks at their camp for 3 consecutive nights, not small stones. Rocks weighing 20 or 30 pounds, hurled from the tree line with enough force to dent their equipment. The crew's foreman, a man named Theodore Roosevelt, no relation to the president, documented the incident in his personal journal, noting that whatever threw those rocks did so with deliberate intent to drive us away. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, reports accumulated, prospectors finding impossibly large footprints in remote mountain passes, hunters glimpsing tall, hair-covered figures moving through timber, railroad workers hearing vocalizations that didn't match any known animal, screams that started low and rose to pitches that made their ears ring. Most of these reports were local news oddities, filed away and forgotten. But a pattern was forming. The encounters clustered in specific areas: the North Cascades, the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, the Olympic Peninsula, the Klamath Mountains, remote regions characterized by extremely rugged terrain, limited access, and very low human population density. Places where something large and intelligent could exist without constant human contact. Places where, if you wanted to remain hidden, you could. And here's where the story takes its first dark turn. Because by the 1930s, someone was noticing the pattern. Federal land management agencies were being established. The National Park Service was expanding. The Forest Service was conducting extensive surveys of wilderness areas. And in the process of cataloging wildlife, documenting terrain, and establishing boundaries, rangers were encountering something that didn't appear in any zoology textbook, something they couldn't explain. And rather than make it public, rather than launch a scientific investigation, someone made a decision to bury it. The first hint that this was policy rather than coincidence appears in a 1937 memorandum from the regional director of the Pacific Northwest Forest Service to his district rangers. The document, uncovered through a Freedom of Information Act request in 2004, is brief and carefully worded. It instructs rangers to report any encounters with unidentified large primates through a separate chain of command, not through standard wildlife observation channels. It emphasizes that such reports should be treated as administratively sensitive and should not be shared with the public or press. The justification given is vague, something about avoiding unnecessary public alarm and maintaining professional credibility. But the implication is clear. If you see something, tell us, but don't tell anyone else. This memo wasn't an isolated incident. Similar directives appear in Park Service documents from the 1940s and 1950s, always couched in bureaucratic language, always emphasizing discretion. By the 1960s, the protocols had become more formalized. Rangers were issued guidelines for documenting unusual wildlife encounters that included specific instructions for reporting anomalous primate activity. The guidelines specified what information to collect: print dimensions, behavior descriptions, vocalizations, time of day, weather conditions. They read like scientific protocols, as if whoever wrote them expected these encounters to continue and wanted consistent data. But crucially, none of this information was ever published. None of it entered the scientific literature. It simply accumulated in internal files, classified under administrative codes that made them difficult to access even for other government agencies. We spoke with David Paulides, a former police officer who spent 2 decades investigating missing persons cases in national parks. Paulides noticed something disturbing while researching disappearances. A significant number of people who vanished in wilderness areas were last seen in regions with high concentrations of Sasquatch reports, not near popular trails or campgrounds, but in remote backcountry zones that require special permits to access. Zones where, Paulides discovered, the Park Service had documented numerous unusual wildlife encounters over the decades, but had never made that information available to the public. When he tried to obtain those records, he was met with bureaucratic obstacles. Requests denied, documents heavily redacted, information classified under exemptions that typically apply to national security matters, not wildlife observations. The pattern was unmistakable, Paulides told us. Certain areas had both high rates of unexplained disappearances and high rates of Sasquatch encounters reported by park staff. But when I asked if the public was ever warned about potential dangers in these areas, I was told there was no scientific evidence of any threat, which raised an obvious question. If there's no threat, why are your own rangers filing reports about encounters with large, unidentified primates? And if there is a threat, why isn't the public being informed? The documentary evidence is fragmentary, but it exists. Internal Park Service reports from 1952 describe an incident in Olympic National Park where a ranger encountered what he described as an upright walking primate, approximately 7 feet tall, covered in dark hair, exhibiting behavior consistent with territorial display. The ranger, a 15-year veteran, noted that the creature didn't flee, but instead stood its ground, vocalized in a way the ranger described as intentionally intimidating, and only withdrew after the ranger retreated. The report concludes with a recommendation that the area be temporarily closed to public access. 2 weeks later, that entire valley was reclassified as a wilderness research zone, effectively making it off-limits without special authorization. No explanation was given. No scientific study was ever published. The closure remains in effect today. Similar incidents appear in reports from North Cascades National Park, Mount Rainier National Park, and Crater Lake National Park throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Each time, the pattern repeats. A ranger reports an encounter. The report is filed through administrative channels. The area is quietly restricted, and the incident is never mentioned again. By the 1980s, the protocols had become standardized across multiple agencies. Rangers knew not to discuss these encounters publicly. They knew their reports would disappear into bureaucratic filing systems, and they knew that if they pushed too hard, if they demanded answers or went to the media, their careers would be effectively over. Former ranger Sarah Mitchell worked in Gifford-Pinchot National Forest from 1989 to 2003. She agreed to speak with us on condition of anonymity, though she's since retired and no longer fears professional repercussions. In 1994, she was conducting a routine trail survey in a restricted watershed area when she encountered tracks. "I've seen bear tracks my entire career," she told us. "I know what they look like in every type of terrain, every weather condition. These weren't bear tracks. They were bipedal, 5 toes, including what looked like a clearly defined big toe, stride length of about 6 feet. The prints were sunk deep. Whoever made them was heavy, and they were fresh, maybe an hour old." Mitchell followed protocol. She photographed the tracks, took measurements, collected a cast, and filed a report. A week later, she was called into her supervisor's office. The prints were attributed to a hoax. The photos were filed as inconclusive, and she was informed that the watershed area would be closed indefinitely for environmental restoration purposes. When she asked why her findings were being dismissed, her supervisor was blunt. "We don't investigate these reports because we already know what they are, and making that knowledge public would create problems we're not equipped to handle." What did her supervisor mean? Mitchell pressed for clarification, but was told the conversation was over. But the implication was clear. The Park Service wasn't denying Sasquatch's existence. They were managing it, treating it as an acknowledged reality that required administrative handling rather than scientific investigation. Over the next 9 years, Mitchell encountered prints on 3 more occasions. Each time, the same thing happened. Report filed. Area closed. No further investigation. "The message was clear," she said. "These things exist. We know they exist, but we're never going to admit it publicly. And if you can't accept that, you need to find another line of work." When we asked why she thought the government would maintain such a policy, her answer was sobering. Liability. If they admit that a large, potentially dangerous primate species exists in national parks and forests, they're admitting they've known about it for decades without warning the public. The lawsuits would be catastrophic. Every missing person case, every unexplained death, every injury that couldn't be fully explained would be re-examined. And beyond that, think about what it would do to public access. How do you manage national parks if people know there's something out there that could potentially harm them? Do you close the forests? Do you require armed escorts? Do you admit that there are species in North America we've never properly documented? The entire paradigm of wildlife management would collapse. So instead, you maintain the status quo. You treat it as administrative reality, but public fiction. You let people keep believing it's a myth because the alternative is chaos. The footprint casts are real. We've examined dozens of them, held in private collections by former rangers, researchers, and witnesses who kept them despite official discouragement. Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum, a professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University, has studied over 300 casts collected from across North America. His analysis is unequivocal. These are not human feet, not bear paws, not any known primate. There's something else. The prints show biomechanical features consistent with bipedal locomotion in a creature weighing between 600 and 800 pounds. They show dermal ridges, the equivalent of fingerprints, that form patterns distinct from human or ape. They show evidence of a midfoot flexibility that doesn't exist in modern human feet, but does exist in early hominid fossils. From a purely anatomical standpoint, Meldrum told us, these prints represent something real. Either there's an undocumented primate species in North America, or someone has been creating incredibly sophisticated hoaxes across multiple states over multiple decades using knowledge of primate anatomy that most hoaxers couldn't possibly possess. And in my professional opinion, the hoax explanation is actually less plausible than the existence explanation. But the physical evidence goes beyond footprints. Hair samples, collected from locations where Sasquatch encounters have been reported, have been analyzed by multiple laboratories. The results are consistent and baffling. The hair is primate, but it's not human, not any species of ape, not any known North American mammal. DNA analysis has produced results that geneticists describe as anomalous, sequences that share characteristics with human DNA, but diverge in ways that suggest a separate evolutionary lineage. In 2013, Dr. Melba Ketchum published a controversial study claiming that Sasquatch represents a hybrid species, something with both human and unknown primate heritage. The study was immediately dismissed by mainstream science, not necessarily because the data was flawed, but because the implications were too extraordinary to accept without far more evidence. But here's what's notable. The hair samples that produced these anomalous results weren't collected by cryptid enthusiasts. Many of them came from official sources: Forest Service collections, Park Service evidence lockers, fish and wildlife repositories, material gathered by government employees during the course of their official duties, documented in reports that were never meant to be public, analyzed in ways that suggest someone somewhere in the federal land management system has been quietly investigating this for decades. The restricted areas tell their own story. On maps available to the public, they're labeled with bureaucratic designations: wilderness research zones, ecological preservation areas, watershed protection districts. Access requires special permits that are rarely granted. The official justification is environmental protection, sensitive ecosystems, endangered species habitat, areas recovering from fire or logging damage. But when you map these restricted zones against historical Sasquatch encounter locations, the overlap is striking. Areas where rangers reported multiple sightings in the 1960s and 1970s were systematically reclassified as restricted access by the 1980s and 1990s. Valleys where indigenous peoples had traditional warnings about Sasquatch presence are now off limits to the public. The reasoning given is always environmental, always bureaucratic, but the pattern suggests something else: controlled access, limiting human presence in regions where encounters are most likely, not to protect the environment, but to protect the secret. In 2007, a Freedom of Information Act request filed by researcher Cliff Barackman uncovered something extraordinary: funding records showing that the Forest Service had allocated budgets for unidentified wildlife monitoring in specific wilderness areas for over 30 years. The amounts weren't trivial: hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, distributed across multiple ranger districts, designated for equipment, personnel, and field observation protocols. When Barackman requested details about what wildlife was being monitored, the Forest Service replied that the information was administratively exempt due to ongoing research. When he asked what research institution was conducting the studies, he was told that information was also exempt. The funding continues to this day, buried in budget line items, documented in internal memos, money spent on monitoring something that, officially, doesn't exist. Either this represents the most elaborate bureaucratic waste in federal history, or someone is watching the watchers, making sure that our national forests remain safe for visitors, not by eliminating a potential threat, but by tracking it, understanding it, and keeping the public away from areas where encounters are most likely. Former Ranger Thomas Caldwell spent 23 years working in North Cascades National Park before retiring in 2015. He agreed to speak with us without anonymity, willing to face whatever professional consequences might come. "I saw one," he said simply, August of 2009. "I was conducting a solo patrol in a remote section of the park, an area that required a helicopter to access. No trails, no campsites, no reason for anyone to be there. I was documenting wildlife populations, checking on habitat conditions. It was about 4 in the afternoon. I'd stopped to rest near a creek when I heard movement in the timber. Heavy movement, something large pushing through dense underbrush. I thought it was a bear initially. Then it stood up." Caldwell paused, collecting his thoughts. "It was roughly 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair, longer on the head and shoulders. The face was flat, more human-like than ape-like, and it was looking directly at me, not with curiosity, not with aggression, with awareness, like it knew exactly what I was and was deciding what to do about me. The encounter lasted approximately 45 seconds. The creature didn't approach, didn't vocalize, didn't display any threatening behavior. It simply watched Caldwell, then turned and walked away, moving through the forest with what he described as impossible quiet for something that size. Caldwell followed protocol. He documented the encounter in detail, including the location, time, his own physical and mental state, and every characteristic he could remember. He filed the report through the designated channels, and then he waited. 2 weeks later, I was informed the area would be closed for the season due to wildlife management priorities. When I asked what that meant, I was told it was above my pay grade. A month after that, I was reassigned to a different district. No explanation given. Just a transfer order that came down from regional headquarters. The message was clear. I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to see, and I needed to be moved away from that area. When we asked Caldwell why he was willing to speak publicly now, his answer was immediate. Because people have a right to know what's in our forests. Not to create panic, but because informed consent matters. If you're hiking in certain areas, you should know there's something out there that's not in the guidebooks. You should know that the wilderness is more wild than you've been told. And you should know that your government has been keeping this secret for the better part of a century, not for your protection, but for their convenience. The vocalizations are perhaps the most disturbing evidence. Anyone can fake footprints. Hair samples can be explained away. Even eyewitness testimony can be dismissed as misidentification, but the sounds recorded in deep wilderness areas are harder to rationalize. The Sierra sounds, recorded in the Sierra Nevada mountains in the 1970s, capture what sounds like language, not animal calls, not random vocalizations, but structured communication. Linguists who've analyzed the recordings identify patterns consistent with speech, varied pitch, rhythmic cadence, apparent turn-taking between multiple individuals. The sounds don't match any known primate. They don't match any known animal. Bioacoustics experts describe them as being produced by a vocal apparatus larger than human, something with a bigger chest cavity, longer vocal cords, capable of producing frequencies both lower and higher than humans can. The recordings have been analyzed for evidence of hoaxing, voice synthesizers, modified animal calls, technical manipulation. No evidence of fraud has been found. Either someone created an extraordinarily sophisticated hoax using 1970s technology, or these recordings capture something real. Rangers in remote areas report hearing similar vocalizations with disturbing regularity. Not often, but consistently. The descriptions match across decades and locations. A howl that starts low and rises, sometimes described as mournful, sometimes as aggressive, knocking sounds like wood striking wood, echoing through valleys, and occasionally, something that sounds like speech, but isn't. Syllabic patterns, vocalized communication that carries emotional weight, even if the words, if they are words, are incomprehensible. In 2011, a group of researchers placed audio recording equipment in a remote valley in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, one of the restricted access zones. Over 3 months, the equipment captured over 80 hours of ambient forest sounds. In that 80 hours, there are 17 instances of vocalizations that match the Sierra sounds pattern, calls and responses between multiple individuals, knocking sequences that appear deliberate, and on one occasion, captured at 2:43 a.m., what sounds like a group moving through the forest while vocalizing to each other. Coordinated movement, communicating positions, demonstrating an organizational capability that suggests intelligence. The researchers submitted their findings to the Forest Service, requesting permission to expand the study. The request was denied. The area was closed to all access shortly afterward. The recordings remain unpublished. Similar cases appear with disturbing frequency. Experienced hikers who vanish without a trace. Children who disappear from campsites and are found miles away in locations they couldn't possibly have reached on their own, with no memory of how they got there. Hunters who are found deceased in positions and locations that make no logical sense, at the top of cliffs they couldn't have climbed, in ravines impossible to reach by accident, sometimes with injuries that don't match any known wildlife attack. The official explanations are always the same: exposure, falls, animal attacks, disorientation, but the rangers who work these cases privately tell a different story. Off the record, when careers aren't at stake, they admit that some disappearances don't fit standard search and rescue models. They admit that in certain areas, at certain times of year, disappearances cluster in ways that suggest pattern rather than randomness. And they admit that in some cases, the evidence, what little there is, suggests the victims encountered something that's not supposed to exist. We need to be clear about what we're suggesting here. We're not claiming that Sasquatch is hunting humans. The evidence doesn't support that. Encounters with humans, documented over decades, are overwhelmingly non-aggressive. Most sightings involve the creature observing from a distance or withdrawing when noticed. The vast majority of people who've claimed to encounter Sasquatch report feeling frightened, but not directly threatened. But in a small percentage of cases, something goes wrong. Territorial boundaries are violated, threats are perceived, or simply, human and creature occupy the same space at the wrong time, and instinct takes over. A creature weighing 700 pounds, with the strength to break substantial tree limbs, with the intelligence to navigate complex terrain and avoid human contact when it chooses to, is capable of significant violence if provoked. And in remote areas, where help is hours or days away, an encounter that turns aggressive could easily result in a disappearance that's never explained. The question isn't whether this has happened. The question is how often, and whether the authorities managing our public lands know more than they're saying. The government's position, or rather, their lack of position, becomes clearer when you examine how other wildlife threats are handled. When mountain lions kill hikers, warnings are posted. Areas are temporarily closed. The public is informed. When bear attacks increase, management strategies are implemented and publicized. When any documented wildlife presents a potential danger, there's a clear protocol. Acknowledge the threat, educate the public, and manage both the human and animal populations to minimize risk. But with Sasquatch, there's silence. No warnings, no management protocols. No public education. Either the authorities genuinely believe it doesn't exist, in which case the protocols, the restricted areas, and the decades of internal documentation make no sense, or they know it exists and have made a calculated decision that public ignorance is preferable to public awareness. Former Park Service Administrator Robert Mitchell, who worked in regional management from 1985 to 2002, gave us perhaps the most honest assessment we've received. "The decision was made long before I got there," he said. "Acknowledge Sasquatch, and you're opening a Pandora's box. You're admitting you've lied to the public for decades. You're creating legal liability for every incident that might be connected. You're potentially forcing closures of vast wilderness areas. You're inviting hunters, researchers, and thrill seekers to flood into sensitive ecosystems, and you're challenging scientific paradigms that people have built careers on." The cost-benefit analysis always came down the same way. Maintain the status quo, keep it administrative fiction and public mythology, manage the reality quietly, and hope nothing happens that forces your hand. But something did happen. Multiple somethings. In the fall of 2023, a group of experienced backcountry hikers obtained permits for a restricted area in North Cascades National Park through a complicated application process typically reserved for scientific research. They spent 2 weeks documenting wildlife and terrain. On their 8th day, they encountered what they described as a family group of Sasquatch, 2 large individuals, and what appeared to be a juvenile. The encounter lasted approximately 10 minutes. The hikers had video equipment. They recorded the encounter. The footage is remarkable. Whatever they filmed is bipedal, covered in hair, moving through terrain with clear, purposeful behavior. It's not a bear. It's not a person in a costume. It's something else. The hikers submitted the footage to the Park Service as required by their permit conditions. The Park Service's response was swift and severe. The permits were revoked. The hikers were informed they'd violated research protocols, though no specific violation was identified. The footage was classified as Park Service property and retained, and the area where the encounter occurred was immediately closed to all access, including research permits. When the hikers attempted to share their story with media, they were contacted by Park Service legal counsel and reminded that their permits included confidentiality agreements regarding any discoveries made during authorized research. Speaking publicly could result in significant fines and potential criminal charges. The footage exists. The encounter happened, but you'll never see the video. You'll never read the hikers' full account. Because the moment they captured definitive evidence, the system that's been protecting this secret for decades activated. The evidence was contained, the witnesses were silenced, and the official position remained unchanged. No credible evidence exists. This is how secrets survive. Not through elaborate conspiracies or dramatic cover-ups, but through bureaucratic processes, legal agreements, and the simple reality that individuals can't fight institutions. The hikers could go public, risk legal action, and be dismissed as hoaxers or attention seekers. Or they could remain silent, keep their footage as a private memory, and move on with their lives. They chose silence. Most people do, because the alternative is too costly. And the truth, when it's finally told, sounds too impossible to believe. The revelation isn't that Sasquatch exists. Rangers have known that for decades. Indigenous peoples have known it for millennia. The revelation is what that existence means. We've built our understanding of North America on the assumption that we know what lives here, that we've cataloged, documented, and classified every significant species. That our wilderness is wild, yes, but wild in predictable, manageable ways. The existence of a large, intelligent primate species forces us to abandon those assumptions. It means there are species we haven't discovered despite centuries of exploration. It means our scientific understanding of North American ecology is fundamentally incomplete. And it means that in the deepest forests, in the most remote valleys, in places most Americans will never visit, something exists that we share the continent with, but have never truly acknowledged. Something that has learned, over centuries of contact, how to avoid us, how to live in the spaces between our maps, how to remain hidden in plain sight, appearing just often enough to maintain the legend, but rarely enough to evade definitive proof. Former Ranger Caldwell put it best: they're not animals in the way we usually think of animals. They're not mindless. They understand what we are. They understand what guns are. They understand that avoiding us is safer than confronting us. They've adapted to human presence the way we've adapted to the wilderness. And they're good at it, better than we'd ever admit. Because if we admitted how intelligent they are, how capable of coexisting invisibly alongside human civilization, we'd have to ask harder questions about what else we've missed. What else is out there, in the places we don't go, living lives completely independent of human awareness. The structures in the forest aren't random. They're communication, territory markers, wayfinding tools, evidence of a culture, however alien it might seem. The vocalizations aren't animal calls. They're language, not language as we define it, perhaps, but structured communication between intelligent beings sharing information across distances, planning movements, warning others, coordinating activities in ways that require abstract thought. And if that's true, if we're sharing the continent with another intelligent species, then every encounter takes on new meaning. Every sighting is a choice they've made to be seen. Every structure we find is one they've allowed us to find. The question isn't whether Sasquatch exists. The question is, what does it mean that they've stayed hidden this long? What does it tell us about their intelligence that they've managed to evade definitive documentation in an age of satellite imagery, trail cameras, and ubiquitous smartphones? Either we're dealing with the most successful hoax in human history, perpetrated across centuries by countless independent witnesses who somehow coordinated their stories without modern communication. Or we're dealing with a species that has developed survival strategies specifically adapted to avoiding human detection. A species that has learned which areas have cameras, which trails have traffic, which valleys to avoid during hunting season. A species that may, in fact, understand human behavior better than we understand theirs. The most disturbing evidence comes from thermal imaging. In 2019, a research team conducting a legitimate wildlife study in a restricted section of the Cascade Range set up thermal cameras to monitor elk migration patterns. The Forest Service approved the study. The cameras operated for 6 months. When the researchers reviewed the footage, they found something unexpected. Multiple instances of heat signatures moving through the forest at night, bipedal signatures, moving with deliberate purpose. The signatures were too large for humans, too consistently upright for bears, and in several instances, the heat signatures appeared to stop and observe the cameras themselves, as if aware they were being recorded. The researchers reported their findings to the Forest Service as required. Within 2 weeks, they were informed their study was being terminated early due to administrative priorities. The cameras were collected by Forest Service personnel. The thermal footage was retained as government property, and the researchers were reminded that their findings were preliminary data, not suitable for publication without peer review. Peer review that would require access to footage they no longer possessed. One researcher, speaking anonymously, told us what they observed in that footage before it was confiscated. These weren't random movements. These were patrol patterns. Whatever we were recording was systematically moving through that valley, night after night, following routes that covered optimal observation positions. They would stop at high points, survey the area, then move on. It looked like security sweeps, like they were monitoring the territory, checking for threats or changes, and on 2 occasions, we recorded what appeared to be multiple individuals moving in coordination, staying in visual or auditory contact with each other, executing what looked like organized search patterns. That level of behavior suggests planning, it suggests communication, it suggests intelligence operating at a level we don't associate with wildlife. The implications are staggering. If Sasquatch possesses this level of cognitive capability, then every aspect of the phenomenon needs to be reconsidered. They're not hiding by accident or instinct. They're hiding by choice. They're not avoiding humans because they're shy or frightened. They're avoiding humans because they've learned, possibly over centuries, that contact with humans is dangerous, that we hunt things we don't understand, that being discovered means being pursued. And so, they've developed a culture of concealment, teaching their young where humans go and where they don't, which seasons are safe and which are dangerous, how to recognize the signs of human presence, vehicles, voices, the smell of campfires, and how to withdraw before contact occurs. They've become, in essence, experts on us. While we've spent decades debating whether they exist, they've been watching us, learning our patterns, adapting their behavior to ensure we remain uncertain. And here's where the government's silence becomes not just understandable, but strategic. If you acknowledge that an intelligent species exists in North American wilderness, you're not just dealing with a zoological discovery. You're dealing with questions of rights, of territory, of sovereignty, in a sense. If Sasquatch possesses near-human intelligence, if they demonstrate culture and communication and social organization, then what's their legal status? Are they wildlife to be managed? Are they closer to indigenous peoples with ancestral claims to the lands they inhabit? The legal ramifications are nightmarish. Every restricted area becomes a potential refuge for an intelligent species. Every logging operation, every development project, every expansion of human activity into wilderness becomes a potential violation of their territory. The lawsuits wouldn't just be about liability for past incidents. They'd be about land rights, about whether the government has been systematically displacing an intelligent species for over a century without acknowledgement or compensation. So the silence continues, not because the evidence doesn't exist, but because acknowledging the evidence would require confronting questions that the government, the scientific establishment, and society at large aren't prepared to answer. It's easier to maintain that Sasquatch is folklore, easier to dismiss witnesses as mistaken or attention-seeking, easier to classify evidence as inconclusive and file it away. Because the alternative, admitting that we share North America with another intelligent species, that we've known about it for decades, and that we've deliberately kept that knowledge from the public, would fundamentally alter our relationship with wilderness, with wildlife management, and with our own understanding of what it means to be human. The final piece of the puzzle comes from the most unlikely source, the Sasquatch themselves, because in recent years, a shift has occurred. Sightings have increased, not dramatically, but noticeably. Encounters that were once rare are becoming more frequent. Trail camera footage, dismissed for years, is accumulating. Thermal imaging, audio recordings, physical evidence, all of it is becoming harder to ignore. Some researchers believe this isn't coincidental. They believe Sasquatch populations may be under pressure, that climate change, habitat loss, and the relentless expansion of human activity into the last wild places is forcing them into closer contact with humans. That the strategies of concealment that worked for centuries are becoming harder to maintain. Others believe something else is happening. That Sasquatch is making a choice to be seen more often. That after centuries of hiding, they're testing whether humanity has evolved enough to acknowledge them without destroying them. That the increased sightings are deliberate, a slow revelation, allowing themselves to be observed more frequently, providing more evidence, giving us opportunities to prove we can coexist with an intelligence that isn't human. We can't know which interpretation is correct, but we can see the pattern, and we can understand that whatever happens next depends on how we respond. If we continue to dismiss, to deny, to classify, and conceal, then the relationship remains what it's always been. Two intelligent species occupying the same landscape while pretending the other doesn't exist. But if we acknowledge what rangers have known for decades, what indigenous peoples have known for millennia, then we face the uncomfortable reality that our wilderness isn't empty. That intelligence exists in forms we didn't predict, and that the last truly wild places in North America are wild precisely because something else lives there. Something that has survived, adapted, and persisted despite everything we've done to deny its existence. The truth about Bigfoot isn't hidden in classified documents or conspiracy theories. It's hidden in plain sight, in the gap between what we claim to know and what we're willing to admit. It's in the ranger reports that get filed and forgotten, in the restricted areas that expand year after year without explanation, in the stories told by professionals who've seen something they can't explain and know they'll be ridiculed if they speak publicly, in the footage that gets confiscated, in the evidence that's dismissed as inconclusive, in the patterns that emerge when you stop asking, "Does it exist?" and start asking, "Why are we pretending it doesn't?" 43 rangers, dozens of restricted areas, decades of documentation, hundreds of credible witnesses, physical evidence that defies conventional explanation, and a government policy that treats the entire phenomenon as something to be managed rather than investigated. The pieces fit together not as proof, but as something perhaps more compelling: consistency. The same story told across generations, across regions, by people who have nothing to gain and everything to lose by speaking up. Either this represents a mass delusion spanning centuries, involving multiple cultures, documented by trained professionals, supported by physical evidence, and somehow coordinated without any central organization. Or it represents reality. A reality we've chosen not to acknowledge because acknowledgement would cost more than we're willing to pay. The rangers who spoke to us aren't asking you to believe without question. They're asking you to look at the evidence with the same seriousness they were forced to suppress in their careers. To consider that wilderness might mean more than we've assumed. To understand that intelligence can exist in forms that don't build cities or write books or use technology. To recognize that coexistence doesn't require acknowledgement, but that acknowledgement would be an act of honesty we owe both to them and to ourselves. And to remember that the next time you're deep in the forest, miles from any trail, surrounded by trees that have stood for centuries, you might not be alone. Something might be watching, something that has learned every trick of survival, every method of concealment, every way to exist alongside humanity without being fully known. Something that has been there longer than we have, and something that, if we're very lucky, might allow us to continue sharing the wilderness as long as we remember. It was never really ours to begin with. The restricted areas remain restricted. The protocols remain in effect. The evidence continues to accumulate in filing cabinets and digital archives that the public will never access. And in the deep forests, in the mountain valleys, in the places where satellite coverage fades and cell signals disappear, something continues to live as it always has, patient, watchful, waiting to see if humanity will ever be ready for the truth. The question isn't whether Bigfoot exists. The question is whether we're prepared to admit what that existence means, and whether, when the final proof emerges, as it inevitably must, we'll respond with curiosity or with the same impulse that's defined our relationship with the natural world for centuries. The need to control, to document, to possess. The rangers we spoke with all express the same fear, not that Sasquatch will harm people, but that acknowledgement will harm Sasquatch. That the moment the secret becomes official, the last refuge of something wild and intelligent and unknowable will be invaded by researchers, tourists, hunters, and opportunists. That the wilderness will become a laboratory, and that will destroy through exposure what they've managed to preserve through silence. Maybe they're right. Maybe the secret is protection. Maybe the lie serves a purpose. Or maybe, just maybe, we've evolved enough to acknowledge an intelligence that isn't our own and resist the urge to dominate it, to simply let it be, to share the continent with something that was here first and ask nothing more than to be left alone. The choice, if it ever truly becomes ours to make, will define not just our relationship with Sasquatch, but our relationship with wildness itself, with the parts of the world that remain untamed, with the mystery that exists in places we haven't mapped and can't control, with the humbling realization that we are not, and have never been, alone. The footprints in the snow will melt with the spring thaw. The vocalizations will fade into memory. The structures will collapse back into the forest floor. But the witnesses remain. The rangers who saw something they couldn't explain. The researchers who found evidence that defied categorization. The indigenous elders who warned us from the beginning, all carrying the same knowledge, speaking the same truth, asking the same question. When will we listen? The answer, it seems, is not yet. The bureaucracy continues. The silence persists. And somewhere in the North Cascades, or the Gifford Pinchot, or the Olympic Wilderness, or any of a dozen other restricted zones marked with bureaucratic designations that mean stay out, something moves through the forest with practiced ease, ancient, intelligent, aware, watching us the way we've always watched the world, with curiosity, caution, and the knowledge that some things are better left undisturbed. That's the truth the Rangers uncovered. Not that Bigfoot exists, they already knew that, but that its existence is protected not by its own stealth alone, but by a system that has decided some secrets serve the greater good. Whether you agree with that decision is between you and your conscience. Whether you believe any of this is between you and the evidence. But if you ever find yourself deep in restricted wilderness, far from any trail, and you hear something moving parallel to your path, just out of sight, staying exactly the distance away that makes observation possible, but identification impossible. Remember what you've learned here. You're not alone. You never were. And something out there has been keeping track of you far more carefully than you've been keeping track of it. The only question that remains is whether that should comfort you or terrify you. The rangers we spoke with couldn't agree on an answer, and maybe that uncertainty is the point. Maybe living with mystery, coexisting with the unknown, accepting that some questions won't be answered in our lifetime, maybe that's the lesson. Not that we should stop searching for truth, but that we should be more careful about what we do with truth once we find it. Because in the end, the greatest discovery isn't proving that Sasquatch exists. It's learning to live in a world where it does, and having the wisdom to let it remain wild.